I've headed over to Berlin for the final 2 rounds of the candidates tournament. Couldn't stay away, it's so dramatic, and this round 13 really lived up to expectations. It's been a fantastic day here in Das Kohlhaus in Berlin. So let me take you through the game between Fabiano Caruana and Levon Aronian. And Caruana with white, and he's had a rest day to try and lick his wounds after this dramatic loss, and well, he certainly came out fighting. So Levon plays his customary Spanish, and the players zip down these moves very, very quickly. Main line, and as we know, Levon is a great exponent of the Marshall Gambit that would take place if white plays c3 in this position, and so on. But Fabiano decided to play d3, of course. It's an anti-Marshall move. There are many moves you can play there. You can play a4, a3, h3, and so on. But d3, of course, a very respectable move. And now d5 makes no sense whatsoever in this position, and the reason is that after white takes this pawn, then white still has, for example here, white still has the c3 square available for the knight. Maybe not immediately, there could be problems with bishop f6, but basically because c3 square is available, then it makes white's development much easier, so the gambit isn't really possible. So d6, everything normal so far. Now bishop d2, that is a little bit unusual in this particular position, although it is seen in other variations of this anti-Marshall. I've played this same idea myself with the inclusion of the moves a4 and bishop b7, for example. So it's a pretty normal move, but not in this exact position. The idea is, of course, that white takes some control over these squares, b4 and a5, before committing with a4 or maybe knight c3 to d5. It's a little bit unusual though. And I mean, personally, if I were black, I think I would take the chance to play bishop e6 in this position, just to try and cut out the light squared bishop. But Levon plays bishop g4, and now white changes tack completely. Obviously knight d4 is a threat here, so Fabiano stops that with c3. Now the bishop on d2 just gets in the way. However, what he's done is tempt the bishop to g4. Now Levon broke straight away with d5, h3, and that pushes the bishop back to h5, and that's not really where black wants the bishop in this variation, because it can get chased down by white's knight coming round via d2 to f1 to g3. So for the moment, Fabiano just has to keep his position steady. Rook b8 played, and that preempts white playing a4. And now bishop g5, of course that bishop had to move. It was pointless being on d2 now that the situation has changed. And this is a very interesting idea actually. Levon, of course now there's pressure on d5. White threatens to take here and take on d5. So Levon exchanges on e4 and hits that bishop. And now the bishop goes right back to c1. So very clever indeed. So that the bishop on g5 provoked the clearing of the center, but also it doesn't mind being hit by h6, because this pawn can actually be a liability. Just imagine if a white knight lands on f5, then it's less easy to kick away the knight with a potential g6, because h6 will always be on prise or a target. So this can be a weakening of black's position. And now white is ready to start the chase down of this bishop. So the plan is basically knight f1 to g3 and potentially knight h4 to get and putting a knight on f5, or maybe just exchanging off that bishop. Of course, we still have to protect the e-pawn first. Whoops, excuse me, the e-pawn first, because it's on prise if once the knight moves. So we have to play bishop c2, but then we'll start the classic Spanish maneuver. So Levon tackles that with knight h5. Now, if he'd, let's say, just preempted any strike with bishop h7, yes, you could play bishop c2. Quite nice to throw in a4 first, just to remind black that that b5 move is a little bit sensitive and could open up the a file as well. And then, well, apart from bishop c2 and maneuvering the knight round, you also have potentially bishop d3 to attack this pawn. So Levon tries to find counterplay with knight h5. So knight comes to f4, so we basically stop that with knight f1, and that can just be traded off. It's bishop c5. Levon trying to play very actively. Obviously, you know, there are now problems potentially on this diagonal for white with a pin or something like that. g3 from Caruana. So stopping anything at all on f4, just cutting out that knight, and now you have to ask yourself, well, you know, maybe the knight's not so clever on h5. Could have just dropped back with knight f6 here, but first he played king h7. King g2, just building up very steadily, so that he's ready maybe to move the knight, and then g3 won't be on prise. Queen e7 and bishop c2. So this sets up potentially b4 and a4, hitting the b5 pawn. And it's also nice to protect e4 as well. I mean, around about this point, it was absolutely clear to me that things had worked out extremely well for Fabiano. There's pressure on b5. Potentially you can also turn your attention to the king side as well and chase down that bishop. And where exactly is black's counterplay? I like this position a lot for white. You know, this is why I play the Spanish. You know, it's always one of my favorite openings to play with white. And here, very interesting moment. Fabiano could have actually captured that pawn on b5 like this, and queen takes b5, but I mean, there are a couple of things. He was obviously worried about some kind of discovered attack here. Maybe bishop f2, maybe knight d4. I mean, knight d4, let's have a very quick look at this. So knight d4, you can take, so discovered attack on the queen, and the rook is on prise, but the thing is, you can actually cover that rook. And, well, I think white is better in this position, but white has to be a little bit careful. You know, you have two minor pieces against a rook and a pawn, but the minor pieces look good to me. But there's obviously something that didn't quite appeal to him. So instead, and I get this, he decided just to play very positionally and chase down that bishop. And then white will have two bishops and still the chance to attack that pawn on b5 by trading and maybe playing bishop d3. So just a very sound position. Queen e6 played. And now it's possible to take that bishop and play bishop d3. I mean, I think this is a legitimate way for white to play, but he was probably worried about some kind of counterattack against f2 at some point in combination with the bishop. So instead, Fabiano played bishop d3 first. Now, there are pros and cons to this approach. Basically, it allows black to play bishop h5. And here, well, Caruana had prepared g4. Now, it's senseless for the bishop to go back. Of course, Aronian had prepared this sacrifice, and now things start to get very hairy. It's possible to play queen takes g4. After the game, Fabiano just said, well, yes, black gets 3 pawns for the piece, like this, but it's difficult for black to advance those pawns, and yes, 2 bishops are very nice. So instead, knight takes g4 from Aronian. I mean, this is much more in the spirit of a sacrifice. If you're going to sacrifice, you want a messy position, and you don't really want to trade queens, so I get that. And at this point, it seemed to me that white's position was just too strong. But let's see. Knight takes pawn, and the bishop is hit, so the bishop has to come back. Now g6. Now, chances to go wrong here. If the knight retreats, then queen h3 is very unpleasant. If the knight comes back here, the knight comes back here, then knight h3 and potentially bouncing into f4. You can play knight d5 here. Maybe white's better, but it's messy. So Caruana had prepared knight to e3, and it looks like a good move. So, for example, g takes f5. This is the game continuation. So white is still a piece up here, and it looks like he's clearing the position. It looks like everything's going his way. And Levon now played e4. However, he missed an amazing shot here, which would have kept him in the game. He could have played knight takes b4. Aronian said after the game it hadn't even crossed his mind. But this keeps black in the game. After rook d4, so black is now 2 pieces down, but suddenly, with the entry into the position of not just 1 rook, but 2 rooks, then this is very serious. So just take a look at this. Rook g8, and now there is a threat to play, it's almost kind of a slow motion threat, to play queen g5 and then queen h5 mating on the h-file. So in this position, white would have to play knight d5. That gets taken. I mean, this obviously prevents the queen going to g5 because the bishop covers. And here, well, I think you could say all bets are off. White is still a piece up, but black has so many pawns now, and this king, is it safe enough? Who knows? Very unclear situation. That was Aronian's chance. Instead, he played e4. But now, Caruana actually takes over the initiative on the king side. Rook h1 is a very strong move. In fact, it's black's king that is in more danger than white's here. Just because white can attack h6 and the king can always just duck back to f1. So rook d6 played here. Bishop takes pawn. Rook g8 check. The king comes to f1. It's on a very safe square actually. Knight e5, and now queen f4. Basically black is just piling up, starting to pile up on h6. Very interesting that white's bishop, which has done a bit of a tour, d2 to g5 and back to c1, is actually very well placed on c1. It's so often the case in the Spanish that this bishop stands well actually on its starting square, even though it's had a bit of a tour. And the game went c6 here. So perhaps dreaming of bringing the bishop back into play via c7, but a takes b5. And now there's a nice tactic. If black recaptures, then rook takes. Of course, this must be taken, a discovered check. If the king retreats, then we take the queen. So knight g6, we take on h6, and knight f5 check, and take the rook on d6, and that really is too much for black to bear. White is still a piece up, and it's completely winning. So after a takes b5, Aronian tried rook g5, but this didn't really help matters. Things even collapsing on this side of the board, and actually white's king very, very safe on f1. If that pawn is blocked, then rook a2 would be, I mean, there are many winning moves, but I like the look of rook a2, just swinging the queen's rook over and hammering the king side. But in this position, queen d8 played by Aronian, and that allows a destructive finish. Check from the bishop. After knight g6, rook takes h6, and in that position Aronian had enough, he resigned. I should say there was time pressure going on here, but just a little bit scary. But actually Caruana said afterwards that he felt pretty comfortable because he just couldn't see what black could do. If king takes rook, then we give a check. We take on g5. Well, black has one check here, and then it'll be white's turn. Queen h6 and queen g7. So, I mean, in the end, a pretty convincing victory for Fabiano Caruana. However, Aronian did miss that big opportunity to fire up his attack again by sacking his second piece, and then who knows what would have happened. So that victory leaves Fabiano Caruana half a point ahead in the tournament. So Caruana with 8 points. Mamedyarov and Karyakin on 7.5, Ding on 7. I should mention that Mamedyarov defeated Grishuk. Incredibly, looked like that game was heading towards a draw. So going into the last round, in fact, 4 players can still win the tournament. Even Ding on 7 points can win the tournament. He has a very slim chance, but it's possible. Last round pairings. Aronian against So, Karyakin white against Ding, Kramnik white against Mamedyarov, Grishuk white against Caruana. Tie breaks could be very important indeed, and it goes first of all on individual results. Against if 2 players are tied, then their individual results count first. If it's still a tie, then it goes to number of wins. But bear in mind, individual results count first in a tie-break. But at the moment, Caruana half a point ahead. He looks like he's in the driving seat. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and do check out the other playlists that we've just set up. Thanks for watching.